Welcome to Talking Postgres. It's a monthly podcast for developers who love Postgres. I am your host, Claire Giordano, and in this podcast, we explore the human side of Postgres, databases, and open source. And that means we try to figure out, why do people who work with Postgres do what they do, and how did they get there? Thank you to the team at Microsoft for sponsoring this community conversation. And I am so excited to introduce today's guest to you. Peter Cooper is our episode 28 guest. Peter is joining us from the UK. And if you don't know Peter, he was formerly chair of several O'Reilly conferences, conferences like Fluent and OSCON Europe. And today, and since about 2010, so what is that? 12 years. It says 2010, but that's more than 12 years. We'll have to talk about that. Peter has been founder and editor-in-chief of Cooper Press, and it's a company that publishes about 7 weekly newsletters that reach it's about 460,000 developers and engineers, including JavaScript Weekly, Front End Focus, Ruby Weekly. I think that was the first one. There's a newsletter for Golang and for React and Node. And my absolute favorite, is Postgres Weekly. And one of the things I love most about Postgres Weekly are the insights and perspectives that get shared in the very short blurbs that, link to new content, new articles, new videos, things that have been recently published. And it's a newsletter that's industry-wide, so it covers Postgres content from all over the Postgres project, around the globe and around all the different companies. So, with that long preamble, welcome, Peter.
Hey, how's it going?
It's good. I'm so glad that you're here.
Today's it feels like we've known each other forever.
It does, but we've only met in person for real once, but actually probably twice. I think the very first time I saw you, maybe I introduced myself, but you probably don't remember. But yeah, I'm glad you were actually in the San Francisco Bay Area a couple of weeks ago, and that kind of led to today. Although,
yeah, you finally managed to convince me.
I am so happy after years of trying. I don't know if you know this, but Michael Christophides, who is one of the hosts of another Postgres podcast called Postgres FM, he sent me a note a number of months ago saying, Claire, I think it would be great to get Peter Cooper on a podcast. and I think your podcast makes the most sense. So make it happen. And hopefully he knows this is happening and he's going to listen to it afterwards.
Yeah, I know his show. I promote it quite often. So yeah, fantastic.
So the topic for today is 12 years of Postgres Weekly. Oh, so how does that work? I get it. You've been working on the newsletter business since 2010, but maybe Postgres Weekly didn't happen for the first couple of years. Is that how the math works?
Yes, that's correct. So Postgres Weekly didn't turn up until quite late in 2012, I believe. I don't have the number in front of me, but I know that it was during the Postgres 9.2 era. So that kind of, puts it into perspective a little bit.
Okay. And when you were in elementary school, I actually don't know.
We're skipping right back.
We're skipping right back. We're going to the beginning of your origin story. And you know
when I was born.
When you were born, how about where you were born? I'm presuming you were born in the UK.
At least I can say something interesting about where I was born. So I was born in Greenwich, pretty much very close to the meridian line. So I know, I was born at 0 degrees. And actually have pretty much lived on that line. Like the 0 degree meridian line actually runs through my current town that I live in. I'm much further north now, in a place called Lincolnshire, but we have the line run through our town. So I've always lived on that Greenwich meridian line. So I'm a GMT child all the way.
Okay. Well, I don't think my question applies to when you were born. I want to fast forward to like elementary school. But how you have to fill out those pieces of paper to bring home to your family that say like, my favorite color is this, and my favorite thing to do, and my favorite food. And usually one of the questions is, what do you want to be when you grow up? So when you filled out that, what do you want to be when you grow up? Did you say, I want to be a publisher that focuses on developers and giving them really useful content? Is that your answer?
No, not quite. I don't remember actually doing that exercise, but my parents always remind me that when I was a child, I really wanted to be a bus driver. So I set my ambitions high at an early age, but unfortunately never got to drive a bus, and instead discovered I was a lot better at sitting behind a keyboard and typing. So it wasn't until my teenage years, though, that I did actually figure out kind of like what I'm doing now almost. So there is a little bit of a story to that. But yeah, it took until I was about 14 or 15 to figure that out.
Okay, so what happened when you were 14 or 15?
So I pretty much programmed my entire life, probably from when I was around like 3 or 4, just because my father was really heavily like geekily into microcomputers in the 80s. So he had them all over the place. He had all sorts of different ones and Spectrums and BBC Micros and things that were popular in the UK, machines that didn't necessarily extend to the US. We had some rather odd machines. And of course, I'd start to play with them, and he encouraged it. And I was just into, just messing around. Obviously, wasn't building, databases or enterprise software at that age, but just, messing around and doing loops and all this type of thing. So programming has always been a part of my life, before I can even remember. So it's kind of been a natural thing for me. But when I was a teenager, I kind of got a lot more into it with like demo coding. So that's where you like make graphical demos. This was back in the DOS days, so it was all quite rustic, let's say. But I got onto the so I got onto the internet in 1990, I'd say early 1995, and I was basically addicted to a part of the internet called Usenet, which is kind of around now, but it's used for pirating movies and stuff. But back in the day, it was kind of like the equivalent of, let's say, like Reddit or forum software, but it kind of ran a very low level on the internet. It's just text. But there were all these different groups where you could discuss with people, whatever your favorite topics were. And so I was actually on a lot of groups. Like I was on the JavaScript group back in 1996. So JavaScript had only just come out, and people were on there asking questions, and we were chatting and everything. But I was very heavily into basic programming, so kind of a slight Microsoft connection there. I was using like QBasic and Professional Basic that Microsoft was producing at the time, Quick Basic 4.5, and I started what I called a fanzine, where I would get submissions from people on the news group of cool programs that they'd written or tips that they had, and then I'd package them together into like a plain text kind of like newsletter format. And then once every couple of months or so, I would then, put that onto the group as a published thing. And the funny thing is, you can actually go back, and there are still archives of these things. So I can go back and look at, the things that I was publishing when I was 14 and 15. It's quite fun to see.
Have you showed your family? Would they get a kick out of this?
Not my current close family, but my parents were aware of it and everything. So but my kids wouldn't find it very entertaining at this point. It doesn't involve Peppa Pig or anything like that. So yeah, my children are not into technology whatsoever, which is rather bizarre given my background. But yeah, I think it's their rebellious streak.
Well, maybe there's still time. You never know. They
you never know.
You. They pivot, they change. Who knows?
Exactly.
Okay, so you kind of found your calling at 14 or 15. But did you know it was your calling, or no? You just...
No, I mean, it was just my hobby. So when I eventually, went through education and I was going to go to college, I was going to go and study law. So my kind of, plan was I wanted to become a lawyer, essentially. That didn't actually end up happening because my parents' plan backfired on them. So my plan after I finished high school was to, just sit around and do what I wanted all summer and then go to college. And my parents, I grew up in a very working class family, and they were like, well, no, you're not going to laze around all summer. You're going to go and get a part-time job or, some kind of job. So, you're going to pay your way. So, I pretty much paid rent since I was 16. And, which is fair enough. That's just the way I was brought up. So I went and got a job. And because this was like the late 90s, the whole, we were kind of early on in that .com era, very early on. And I managed to get a job at what was then called a new media company in London, who were building websites that, was some of the earliest big budget websites. And I just kind of got hooked on working. So I was like, oh, okay, I'm not going to go to college. I'm just going to keep working in this industry. So yeah, that kind of backfired. So I never actually became a lawyer. I just kind of fell into a job that naturally meshed with my, personal interests, and it just happened to be there at the time, but that wasn't the plan.
I can't imagine your parents' conversations, like talking about how it backfired and how, oh, we shouldn't have said that. We should have done something different. But of course, I'm sure that they were quite pleased with how you landed, um, even though it wasn't the
Yeah,
plan.
but I still didn't get to goof off that summer. I basically spent, I was doing 9-hour work days with a 3-hour, commute each day as well. So it was like, yeah, ridiculous. But I get dropped into the, the work world and, really at the deep end, and just went from there.
Okay. Now, for anybody listening to this podcast who is unfamiliar with Postgres Weekly, you should definitely go check it out. Postgresweekly.com
Correct. Yeah.
is the right URL. And I remember when I first started working at Citus Data, it was maybe my first day at work, my second day at work. It was absolutely on the to-do list from my boss saying that you have to subscribe to this newsletter. It'll be
What
really
year
useful.
would that have been?
What?
What year
What
would that
year?
have been?
2017.
Okay.
So
The reason I point that out is just because for the first couple of years of the newsletter, we had a different person was curating and editing it. So our first editor was someone called Craig Kirstians, who a lot of people in the Postgres world will be familiar with. He essentially phased out over time, but yeah, by 2017 or whatever, it was pretty much me, doing everything at that point.
Okay. Yeah, and Craig worked at Citus Data as well.
He did.
So I worked very closely with Craig, and so maybe that's part of why Umer suggested, oh, you have to go subscribe to Postgres Weekly, because he knew about it from Craig, or maybe it was just, pervasive and considered generally useful. I do know I got a note from someone who is a senior leader in one of the many Postgres startups in the world. And he said that, quote unquote, I'm reading his DM to me right now. He said, Postgres Weekly is one of the only newsletters I'm subscribed to. And so I do think a lot of us read it, and it's super useful. So anyway, small plug there that if people are new to it, it's worth subscribing to. And I don't just say that because you're a guest on the show. I'm not just being nice. It's really, really quite useful.
Yep. No, I'm happy to get as many plugs in as possible. So yeah, that's a nice big tick.
So what caused you to create a newsletter business? Let's fast forward from your 14 or 15, and then you didn't go to college and become a lawyer, and then you were working at a new media company. You were building websites, and then there must have been something that happened between that and starting to write these developer newsletters and founding Cooper Press.
Yes. So I rapidly got sick of having a full-time job. Quite amazing for someone that's still a teenager, but I kind of realized after about 9 months of that was much more than I ever wanted to go through, and I was done with it. So I began working for myself, kind of as a contractor, as a, just someone who had digital skills, and if you got in touch with me, I could put them to use for you, and you gave me money. It's kind of a thing now that so many people do, but at the time, for a teenager, it's a bit of a weird thing to do. But my father had always been, well, not always been self-employed, but had been self-employed for at least 10 or 20 years by that point. So he was familiar with how it all worked, and so it didn't seem like a scary leap to me to do that type of thing, because I had contacts and people hitting me up to do work. So I did that for some years, and eventually I got into blogging and was blogging about Ruby quite a lot, the Ruby programming language, and Ruby on Rails in particular. And I had a publisher called Apress reach out to me and say, oh, we've seen your blog, would you be interested in writing a Rails book for us? And I said, no, I'm not interested in doing that. I said, I'd rather write a Ruby book for you, just because I liked Rails, but I was much more interested in the language behind it. So I said, there's a massive hole here for, a book that could teach people Ruby from the ground up. There's some fantastic reference books and things like that, but there wasn't much for kind of in the style of the 1980s programming books that I was used to, hundreds of pages, and, it would take you through every single tiny little baby step. So I said, let's do that. And they were like, great, let's do it. So I started a blog to help promote the book. Now, back in sort of the noughties, as I call them. So this was like 2005, that kind of area. It was very common to launch a blog to promote something. So whereas nowadays you might launch a podcast or you might launch a newsletter, back then it was launch a blog. So I launched a blog and just started posting, updates about the book and things about that were going on in the Ruby world. And eventually the book completely eclipsed any success that the blog eclipsed the success that the book had, and became basically the most popular Ruby blog out there. And that was basically almost my full-time business for a handful of years, and did very, very well. This was the era when blogs like TechCrunch and so on were coming up, and they were making tens of thousands of dollars just having tiny little 125 by 125 pixel ads on the side of the site. I did something very similar. I didn't make tens of thousands of dollars, but I did more than well enough to pay my way. And eventually I got to a point where I saw there was lots of things going on with email. There were companies like Groupon and Living Social and Help a Reporter Out, and there were all these types of email projects. And I just thought, well, let's try and just turn this blog into, have a newsletter on the side. And again, like the blog took off as a side project, the newsletters took off as a project. And that was the very first newsletter. It was rubyweekly.com. That was in about 2010, but kind of 2011 as well. It spread over this period where it kind of got formalized into a company. But by 2011 we were very formally established, and that was our one newsletter at that time.
Okay. Now, what was the name of the Ruby blog?
Ruby Inside, and I can never remember if it's actually still up or not, because it's literally on an old server that's just a HTML mirror image of what used to be there. In fact, yeah, it's still there. RubyInside.com. In fact, it's so old it doesn't even have HTTPS. And actually, it looks like someone has put loads of spam over the top 2 posts, so I need to sort that out. But that shows you how often I go to this website, which is like never. So
yeah. It's kind of got the look of, how you walk into an old house and it's full of old furniture and it doesn't look modern at all. This doesn't look modern. I'm not insulting it. I'm just like, wow, I feel like I'm going back in time when I look at it.
So yeah, I mean, I haven't posted to it for 11 years, so it's probably running an antique WordPress. I did kind of delete all of the parts of WordPress that are usually the most hackable parts, but it looks like someone's managed to figure it out slightly. So at least I found a new project to work on now, which is cleaning up the site.
Okay, and the book that you published, Beginning Ruby from Novice to Professional, Aaron just posted it in the chat.
Oh, cool.
Is that still relevant? Do you still recommend it to people? I'm imagining it has stood the test of time.
Yes and no. So I have plenty of funny stories to do with the book as well, but it's now on its 4th edition. So I was involved in the first 3. I had kind of a few run-ins with the publisher, let's say, and a slightly testy relationship with them. And so when they came to me for the 4th edition, I was like, I just can't be bothered with this anymore. And they said, well, that's fine, but we reserve the right to get someone else in to, basically write the 4th edition. Your name will still be on the cover, but their name, they'll become the lead author of the book. And I said, that's totally fine. Like, I think the book's run its course by this point. It's written in a slightly old-fashioned style for now. Not many people buy 600-page programming books at the moment. And so I was happy to do that. So the book is out there in a 4th edition. Okay. But yeah, it's gone through some history, but it's done well over its time.
Okay. I love hearing the backstories. I also have to tell you, maybe the reason you and I get along, I was supposed to be a lawyer too. And then I didn't go to law school. So, but it was the plan. Everybody knew I was going to be a patent lawyer. And I started working at Sun and just never looked back. Anyway, so
yeah, it never happened for either of us. And now I look back and I think I really wish I'd become a doctor. So, it's we have all these kind of like, thoughts about what our career could have been and should have been. But here we are.
So you create Postgres Weekly. I'm looking at the very first issue, which was actually easy to find, because if I go to postgresweekly.com and then I look at, the latest edition, you have those previous and next links at the top left and the top right.
Yeah.
But I noticed in the URL you just have the edition, or I don't know, do
Yes.
you call them editions or versions? I'm not sure. And so I just replaced the 603, which is the latest one, with the number 1, and I can see it from March 13th, 2013.
Yep, it's super easy for all those AI bots to crawl. It's very easy to navigate around.
And that was on purpose, I'm assuming. Well, not you didn't do anything on purpose for AI bots back in 2013, but I'm assuming it was for the crawlers, right?
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, it doesn't hurt us whatsoever for anyone to crawl our stuff and to link to our stuff. So yeah, there's literally no downside to making it. There's no point in us making it difficult.
Yeah, you can see at the top it says that Heroku's Craig Kirsteins was the chief curator in the beginning.
Yes.
But what's the story on how this first one happened? Were you already keen on Postgres yourself? Did you have the vision that Postgres was going to grow like gangbusters, or did Craig come to you, or how did it all happen?
This is going to be extremely boring because I actually cannot remember. I don't remember how it came together, but I'm going to guess just from a bunch of context that I have that I believe Craig probably did approach me to do it. And the reason that I say that is because although I was reasonably pro Postgres at that time, I wasn't an active day-to-day user of it. That did follow on. But in everything that I was using up until that point, I had pretty much been using MySQL or whatever, just to that point. And I think part of that comes from my Ruby background. So the Ruby world was very, very heavily into MySQL rather than Postgres. It's changed a little bit now, although 37 Signals, I believe, are still heavily invested in that rather than Postgres. But so just because of my background, I wasn't in the Postgres space at the time. So I'm going to predict that Craig did come to me, and especially because at the time he would have been working for Heroku when they were building out their big, Postgres hosting thing. So, yeah.
Well, obviously, the space has grown, the investments in Postgres have grown, the number of hyperscaler cloud offerings has grown. Like the Postgres landscape has developed since you started this newsletter. That's my perception. What's your perception as a newsletter publisher? Like, did it exceed expectations, or has it not yet met your expectations?
It is. Well, the newsletter itself is actually still our smallest of all our newsletters, and I'd say it punches above its weight in terms of impact and community and so on. But in terms of raw numbers, it's like a tenth of the size of our JavaScript newsletter. So, is the Postgres community 10 times smaller than the JavaScript one? It's kind of hard to say. Like, I haven't, got good numbers on that. But yeah, it's worked out totally fine. And, it has grown alongside the industry, and we've got some great readers who reach out to me, and people tell me of, mention the newsletter in various places and so on. So yeah, it could always be doing a lot better. Let's put it that way. But that's obviously part of the thing about plugging it on shows like this as well. So yeah, everyone sign up, and it will do even better.
So how do you find the Postgres links that you include each week? And what's your I'm going to ask two questions at the same time, which is probably a really bad best practice. But what's your guiding principle for deciding what to include?
So you're asked multiple questions. I could take the political way of just saying what I want to say and just ignore the questions, but I will try and go through them in order. So you started by asking, where do I find things? And obviously, initially it was Craig doing it, so he had all these contacts, and he was on Twitter all the time, and kind of just had the inside track on everything. Over time, as I began to take over more of that role, part of it came through the fact that I was actually beginning to use Postgres increasingly more, so that really helped me out. So I was beginning to engage with people on Twitter that were well known in the space. So they would tweet about something, and I'd be like, "Oh, there's some news. I can include that." That's still relevant. Probably less relevant now than it was up until a few years ago, but that's still one way of finding things. But then actually Postgres is super well represented on sites like Hacker News, for example. I mean, that's just one of many. There's other ones, like Lobsters and Reddit, and there's a whole bunch of different kind of community aggregators and Planet sites and things like that. But just picking on Hacker News, there are just so many items that get added to Hacker News that are Postgres related. It just seems to be a natural place that people in this space gravitate towards. Even if they're not, commenting on there, even if they don't like Hacker News, they submit their post to it, or they're like, "Oh, can you vote up my post?" or this type of thing. Please don't send me those types of messages. So yeah, I find a lot of stuff on there, and part of it is because I've been on Hacker News actually since the very, very early days, and I also am glued to the newest page on there. So for people that are not familiar with Hacker News, you've got the front page, which has like the top 30 items as of right now. But then there's also a page called Newest that you can click on at the top, and it's like the raw fire hose of items that have been submitted to the site. Now, I would guesstimate that perhaps only about 1%, probably less actually, of the items that are added to Hacker News actually get upvoted and put onto the front page. But that doesn't mean the other 99% are just, trash. There's a lot of good stuff in there. And so people will often post all their blog posts and, corporate news and things like that. And if you stay glued to that Newest page, or you subscribe to it through RSS like I do, you might end up with like 1,000 things to look at each day, but you can quickly skim through and be like, oh yeah, there's something interesting. So that is a massive source of kind of items from just disparate places for me. But then you can add to that, we've built up obviously over time. We've linked to hundreds of different blogs, and each time we find a new blog that's talking about Postgres, it gets added to my feed reader. So I'm then following it forevermore, and so I find stuff that way. That probably makes up about, so let's say like Hacker News and Twitter and Reddit and so on make up about a third. The feeds that I subscribe to probably make up another third. And then the other third roughly is people that then send us emails. So you can reply to any issue. And, we do get this every single week. People reply and say, oh, I've just posted this, or I've just released this extension. Can you check it out? And then, we don't post everything that we're sent, but quite a lot of it makes it in. So we kind of have this nice split of different ways that we find things, roughly by thirds, I would say.
Okay, so I've got to ask you, what do you use for a feed reader?
I am currently using two different ones for very bizarre, complex reasons, but I use one called Feedbin, which is at feedbin.com, which just as it happens to be implemented on top of Ruby on Rails. So I like to support that. And I think it's open source as well, so you can actually download your own copy and run your own version of it. And then I'm also using a system called Feeder, which is at feeder.co. And the reason for that is that it has this kind of cool Teams interface. So the other people that I work with can look at the same feeds that I'm looking at. So if there's any kind of like, blind spots or whatever, they can catch things that, I didn't catch, or they can catch things before I see them. So that quite often happens as well. So yeah, I use two different feed readers.
Okay. When you said it had a cool Teams interface, I was thinking, Microsoft Teams is integrated with that. I
No,
didn't
not
know. That's
Microsoft Teams.
not what you meant. Got
No.
it. Okay. Yeah, I've not found a good feed reader ever since Google shut down my favorite one. So, which, as you know, was quite a number of years ago.
Well, I would say that feedbin.com is definitely the closest to the reader experience that I've found. And it has all the keyboard shortcuts that work in exactly the same way, and JK and L and all that sort of stuff, jumping up and down. And
okay, so like
it's
VI
my
based or something.
Yeah. Sorry, say again.
VI based then, JK and L.
Yes.
I don't know.
Yeah, okay. It has the VI style, keyboard shortcuts and things, which actually I think Feeder does as well, but I'm not quite so keen on Feeder. But it does have some extra features that we need in the company. But yeah, feedbin.com is worth looking at, especially as it's open source, and it might even use Postgres for the database as well. I'm not quite sure. I haven't looked into that, but it wouldn't surprise me.
Okay. Yeah, I wonder if anyone on the chat knows the answer to that question. So we'll see. We'll see if anybody chimes in. I think one of the things that I've talked about with people about your Postgres weekly newsletter in particular is how on the one hand, it's very fair. in the sense that it feels like you share links from all the different companies, all the different countries. Like you really do canvas a lot of sources. And I'm always finding things that were not in my feeds, right? That I was not going to catch on my own on Twitter or LinkedIn or Blue Sky or Mastodon or all the places I pay attention to. So I love that kind of breadth of perspective. And yet, in addition to being fair, it's also opinionated. Like when I read your blurbs, you don't just factually pass on an article. This is an article about logical replication published by so and so from this company. Like it's not like that. It's not boring.
Mm.
Your blurbs have opinions about what is being presented in that article or link or video or whatever it is. So, is that like, do you write them all and is it always your opinion? Or do you have a style guide and have a team of people writing those blurbs and therefore you've each tried to adopt a similar tone of voice? Like how does it happen?
In the case of Postgres, it is 99% me. I do work with someone who is in the company and works on the editorial side, and he will occasionally see an item that's really, really like straightforward, and he'll write it up, and I'll often tweak it, or sometimes I'll post it if it's spot on. But in terms of most of the opinionated and technical stuff, yeah, with Postgres it's 99% me, and just to kind of give some background as to why I have that style, a lot of it comes from being English. And you might think, well, how does that work? And the reason is I grew up with the BBC. And for all of its kind of warts and problems, especially nowadays, just over the years, the BBC kind of has this reputation of kind of being a big tent. So it can't just say, we're going to go along with whatever the politics of the day are. Whoever's in charge, like, we'll just, cuddle up to them. They're
Being
always
a big what? Being a big, what was
a
the
big
word you
tent.
used? A big tent. Okay, got it.
Yeah, I guess I don't know if that's a word that's an idiom that's used anywhere else, but in England, it's kind of means to adopt, a broad set of viewpoints. So you don't want to leave people outside the tent, as it were. You want everyone to be within the tent, and then you get to have the largest coverage. So there's no like companies, in the Postgres space that I want to be outside that tent. I want everyone to be inside the tent, and then we write about everyone, good or bad, however we see it at the time. And so the BBC does this culturally. They actually have, as part of their conditions for being able to collect the TV license in the UK, which is basically a tax we pay to watch the TV. As ridiculous as that sounds, part of the condition behind that is that they provide programming for underrepresented communities, whether that's ethnic communities, religious communities, just all different types of thing of that nature, because they have to basically be there for the entire United Kingdom. And so in a very similar way, some of that I've picked up some of those kind of ideas through osmosis to use in my newsletters, where maybe I'm not particularly interested in, let's say, I don't know what, a particular company is doing. Let's say I'm not interested. Let's just say, for example, that I was really anti-Microsoft, which I'm not. But it's, an easy thing to pick on, as I remember all the kind of the background of, people into Linux didn't like Microsoft, those old kind of wars people used to have. Let's say I was in that kind of camp. Well, I would still believe that I still need to, faithfully represent everything that Microsoft's doing if it's doing important work in the Postgres space, which it does. So I'm not tribal about anything. I kind of look at all the different things, and even though I have opinions about, oh, this company's doing something better than this company, I'm not just going to say, well, we're going to kind of ignore this whole section of, the ecosystem just because I don't like it. And so that's why it's a very broad tent, and, I try and keep everything included.
I think maybe that's why people are so supportive of the newsletter and will recommend it to others and will recommend it to new hires, right? Because you're not tribal and because it seems fair. And I've never heard this idiom of the big tent before, but I'm going to run with it. I love it. What a great image that brings to mind. Cool. And just for the record, let me repeat that I would like to believe that Microsoft is doing good things for Postgres, and hopefully you believe that as well. And you just decided to nitpick on us because I'm here and I
I
get it.
think it's just because I was picking up on something very historical. So because I was around 20 years ago, kind of in these spaces still, and the Linux ecosystem and everything, there was obviously a period of time where Microsoft by certain people was seen as the enemy company and all this type of nonsense,
Right,
which
right.
has actually been kind of like withdrawn to a large extent. We don't see that hostility now. I mean, there obviously exists in some camps, but broadly, Microsoft has made so many great steps forward into communities like the Postgres community, and releasing things like Visual Studio Code, and there's just so many different things. Even in .NET, bringing in the Mono project and all these types of things, and WSL, and I guess it's just completely countless the number of things that Microsoft does now. But it's a totally different era. I mean,
It
to
is.
what it was 20 years ago.
Well, I started in Citus. Well, I didn't start my career in Citus, but I started my Postgres work at Citus Data. And then about 2 years after joining, we were acquired by Microsoft. And it was really interesting because friends of mine, former colleagues and teammates who were like, especially the Sun Microsystems friends, they were all over the industry at this point, right? Because most of them were no longer at Sun. And I would get these notes and these DMs and these calls saying, Claire, if this had happened to you 5, 10 years ago, I would be offering to help you find a new job and commiserating with you. But you know what? Congratulations. This is pretty cool. And I heard that same theme in multiple conversations. And it was kind of cool. It really was kind of cool. And yeah, thank goodness. It's nice if we're going to get acquired by another company, you want to like that culture, right? And like that team that you're joining. So anyway,
Yeah, I was acquaintances with the GitHub founders just because they came from the Ruby on Rails world, because GitHub was originally developed entirely in Rails. And so I used to hang out with them on IRC and chat rooms and stuff like that. And, I know they had very similar things happen there because obviously, GitHub was acquired by Microsoft, and, it was kind of, that was at the period, I think, where the attitudes was just starting to shift. But people were still concerned, like, oh, Microsoft's going to take all that source code and all this type of thing. So, but has turned out to be an extremely good steward of GitHub. So,
yeah.
I think that helped a lot.
Git and GitHub are near and dear to me because I started my career at Sun in developer tools. So I worked on a predecessor to a predecessor to a predecessor of Git and GitHub. So anyway.
Yeah, all these worlds are colliding. It's very nice.
Okay, so I'm curious. Obviously not everybody who reads a book is curious about the act of writing that book and what the author went through. But I am, and I get to ask the questions. So I'm curious about the process for putting together a newsletter. And I fully respect that might be aspects about the process that are like your secret sauce that you don't want to tell us about because you don't want anyone to be able to replicate what you do, the magic in your newsletters. But seriously, tell us what you can about creating a new edition of Postgres Weekly besides the sources that you already covered.
So we have an internal system that is kind of like the core of all of this, in terms of us collecting together links and writing things up. And we have a few external curators, not for Postgres, but on some of our other titles. So we can all use this system that we have internally, which was built, sort of about 12 years ago, and it's barely changed over that time. It's essentially, a bookmarking system, but kind of like turned up to 11. That allows numerous people to use it, and allows us to collaborate on writing things up and stuff like that. But it also acts as kind of like a queue of things for us to include. So there are basically tens of thousands of links in this thing, and so I can always see when we linked to something in the past, and I can see information about how often we've linked to something, and there's always different things I can look up, so I can really get a good feel for like the rhythm of including certain things or certain topics in newsletters. So that always really, really helps. But then, in terms of on a weekly basis, what I do is, I'm addicted to Hacker News and Reddit and all these different sites anyway. I'm always in my email inbox. Even though I take forever to reply to emails, I am always reading my emails. And so things are getting added into this essentially queue for future issues all the time. So I can literally go on there right now. I'm going to be doing Postgres Weekly tomorrow, and there will already be 20, 30 different things that have been added over the past week that are of some interest. And then there's hundreds of things. So yeah, well, exactly. You sent me some things, but there's hundreds of things as well from previous weeks that just never made it in. So sometimes, if we're really desperate for something, or we want to try to build up a connection between two stories, sometimes I'll go back and look for things that join the dots together. So that's kind of probably like the most journalistic-y part of the job. I mean, it's not a journalistic job whatsoever, but that's the part where I'm trying to, flesh together a story or a chain of items that kind of relate to each other sometimes. We have this system that allows me to do that. But then basically the way it really works is that when we get to the day of publication is I will then hit up all my different feeds that I'm looking at. I'll go and do last minute checks of like Postgres website and some of the prominent people in the space just to make sure nothing has just dropped at the last minute, which it quite often does. And yeah, I get those things into the system and written up. And then what happens in that system is there's kind of a bunch of stages that items go through. So we can just push raw links into it and say, these need to be reviewed, or this is like something we definitely want to do, or this is something that's kind of borderline, or it's a submission or whatever. I will literally kind of take a prioritized look at that. So if there's anything marked as to do, this is really urgent, then obviously I will tackle that first. And then we work our way down until essentially we have the right number of items to work with the issue. And we also have a real-time collaborative editor for the newsletter. So we have a slightly odd proprietary system because back when we began doing this, we used MailChimp. And MailChimp's editor was really, really slow, and it was really designed for marketing emails. It wasn't designed for the type of thing that we do. So because they had an API, I built numerous different editors over the years that allowed me to write issues in our own kind of XML style language, which is actually a little bit like MJML. If anyone's familiar with MJML, it's like a format for HTML email that then gets compiled down to the HTML and plain text and CSS in a way that works across different email clients. Well, before that existed, I built our own system, which we still use. It allows us to mix things like Markdown, HTML. It allows us to put things in like mastheads in, with a special masthead tag. And we have all these different tags that we use for things. And then it shows so on the left-hand side, you've got the code, a little bit like a modern Markdown editor. You can on the left-hand side, you've got the code. On the right-hand side, you've got the live preview of the issue. So I can go to the issue right now for tomorrow, and it will be pretty much empty except the sponsors. But I can then gradually over time just add in the links. And then eventually we click a button and then it uploads it to the website. It puts it into our email system. And I can do things like start sending tests. And, eventually we can move on to actually sending the final thing once it's passed all its reviews. But the process is, it's not a complex process. It's just lots of different proprietary bits and pieces that we've put together over the years to make it really streamlined so that we can focus on our job being the curation and reading things. And, often we test things that we link to, if it's a new project and we're like, well, this doesn't look quite right. We'll give it a test to make sure it all works. So we can focus on that part of the job, which is the interesting part, and not how am I going to make this render in the, different email clients and things. That's the part that we've sorted out and we outsourced to all these other systems.
But the rendering and not getting caught up in spam filters and making sure that the emails get across, like that's the part that so many people can screw up on, right? Even if they have a beautifully written, really interesting newsletter, if you're not paying attention to those technical bits under the covers, people won't necessarily get your mail, or when they do, it won't look right. It won't be so readable.
One advantage that I've got is that I've been doing this for a long time, so I know where to go, when there's bugs in the email sending process. I know roughly where to look. Like if you're a developer, then you know where to look for bugs once you're sufficiently experienced. We also use some other systems. So litmus.com is one that we use, which is kind of expensive now. It used to be quite cheap, but you can send your email to them and they will render it in 50 different email clients, and you can visually see it on the screen, and it will let you see what your email is going to look like. So we use that when we introduce new units to an issue, just to make sure that everything renders fine. But we do have some funny stories over the years of things that have broken email systems, things that you wouldn't expect. So the one story that I often bring up is we had an issue of, I can't remember what newsletter it was, but it was constantly going to the spam in Gmail. And every single test we ran, spam, 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 spam. Now, what we did was we actually have this system that allows us to kind of run almost like a binary search over our emails. So it will send out emails with like half the items in and then the other half of the items, and then you pick the one that worked, and then it will put in half of the broken items, and it will basically work its way down to working out what item was it that broke the email. And we found this website that broke the email, and it was just a innocent developer blog. But the thing about their domain name is it began with 0x, which anyone who's been developing for some time, or uses C, for example, will know that if you use 0x, you use that to notate hexadecimal numbers in a language like C. And I was like, well, why would that trigger it? Well, it turned out that you can also create URLs that are called long IP URLs. Now, you almost never see these. So if you have like a URL like HTTP, 1.2.3.4, it will go to the IP address 1234. You can, however, write IP addresses in what's called a long IP form, which is basically if you take the 32-bit number. This is getting very technical now. If you take the 32-bit number that 1.2.3.4 represents, you can then turn that into the 32-bit integer, put 0x in front of it, notate it in hexadecimal, give it to the web browser, and it will still go to that IP address. That, I believe, still works in web browsers. I'm not sure if it does, but it did 10 years ago. Now, the problem is that Gmail added, in its infinite wisdom, a filter so that if anyone sent an email that involved a long IP URL, it would immediately put it into spam because it was being used very heavily by people trying to scam people and get around all these types of things. But they got the filter wrong. So they just looked at any URL that began 0x, and they didn't notice that the fact this was like 0x something something something.com or whatever the TLD was. And they shouldn't have done that. So I reported the bug. They eventually fixed it, and happy days. But for some period of time, people that had links going to 0x anything was completely broken in Gmail. So that's just one example of some silly tiny thing that made a massive difference. And we've run into so many of those over the years, but that's just one. I mean, and you can see how deep that one got.
Right. So a lot of details that have to be sweated in order to make this work. Are there speaking of, that's a memory about the technical implementation of the newsletter and staying out of the spam filters. Are there any other memories that are worth kind of going down the lane and talking about, I don't know, shifts you've seen in the Postgres ecosystem, or particular articles or news that came out? I know we've had a lot of big news in the last couple of weeks with 2 big acquisitions of Postgres startups, right? Both Neon and, I don't know if you'd call Crunchy Data a startup, but both of them acquired by much bigger players. But over the last 12 years, does anything stand out to you? Because you've seen the patterns as they've evolved.
I can't pick individual blog posts because, I mean, literally, you think about the amount that I read. So many things just go through my brain out onto the page and then they're gone. So there's very few blog posts that kind of like really stick with me for years and years. But the broad stories stick with me a lot better. So in terms of overall trends and things like that, one massive difference that we've seen just from 12 years ago to now is that we do write about the business side of things a lot more. 12 years ago, Postgres was seen in a very different way from a business perspective. We were, if you go back 12 years ago, that's actually when Amazon RDS first introduced its Postgres support, was in 2013, just after we launched. And people weren't really that heavily talking about it at the time. It was news, but it wasn't news in the way that it would be if, Amazon launched a new Postgres thing now, like they have with DSQL. corporate news in the Postgres space just wasn't that big a deal back then, whereas now it's a massive deal, whether it's Supabase, getting funding, or even things like this week, Timescale is, renamed to Tiger Data. Like that's a story now, whereas it wouldn't have been 12 years ago. So I've seen that occur, the growing role of companies in the ecosystem. But there are also things that haven't changed over the years that when I was kind of doing my research for this, I realized just how important extensions are to Postgres' success, because the very first thing that we linked to in Postgres Weekly all those years back was an extension that allowed you to do stuff with the hyperloglog algorithm in Postgres, which I don't think the extension is relevant now. But the fact is, we've covered extensions all the way through, and it hasn't changed. Like, it's still very, very important. And still an ongoing debate and a discussion. And it's also a massive difference to MySQL and lots of other databases where there isn't that extension ecosystem. It's been so important to the Postgres ecosystem, something that I really enjoy seeing go on. So that hasn't changed at all. But then, the things that stand out to me are just when new things are introduced that kind of kick Postgres up to the next level. So as I said, we started in the Postgres 9.2 era, and 9.2 was a notable Postgres release just because it introduced JSON. So Postgres went from this kind of idea of it just being a row store essentially to being a multi-model store. You could do some document kind of basic document stuff with it, and now that's just moved on and on and on over the years. We've had JSON-B, we've had things like PG Vector come in. There's other there's the Apache product that adds graph support to Postgres. There's PostGIS, and things have just grown and grown and grown. And now you can look at Postgres as being a true kind of multi-model database at some level, thanks to its extension support and thanks to all of these different things being added in at the base level. And so it's really been fun being on that journey and seeing Postgres evolve, but having such fertile ground to grow on that a lot of other database systems just haven't had. So that's been really exciting to see, all of that growth.
Sometimes when I give talks that focus on the history of Postgres, I will take a screenshot of the original paper that was published by Michael Stonebreaker and Lawrence Rowe called The Design of Postgres. And I just love the fact that number 2, I'm looking at it in front of me so I can read it exactly. Number 2 on that design doc is provide user extendability for data types, operators, and access methods. And it just wows me that was part of the design from the very, very beginning. Now, obviously, some aspects of extension support didn't come in till later, but it was the intention from the beginning. So,
yeah. Whereas that wasn't the case with MySQL. Now, I just want to say, I don't know whether you say MySQL or MySQL. I tend to say MySQL, but obviously you can say it either way. But I mean, that was one difference with that, is that even though MySQL can be extended, it's harder, a little bit riskier, less kind of rewarding essentially than in Postgres, where it's so simple. Postgres has much more kind of API stability, and it has more hooks to hook into it. And this is one thing that we've covered over the years as well, is people releasing toolkits and libraries for building Postgres extensions with languages like Rust and Zig, and even with things like JavaScript and Perl, and I've not seen it in Ruby, I must admit, but all these different languages you can build things in, and it's actually not that difficult. Almost anyone that is a software developer, if they really wanted to right now, they could sit down and they could figure out how to build a Postgres extension and distribute it and get people to install it in a way that you just can't do very easily with other database systems. And I think that has had a massive effect on Postgres' current status.
I want to circle back for 1 second to a thread from earlier when you were talking about your feed readers. And Rob Treat on the chat did look it up. And I think, he looked it up and I had it in front of me and now I don't. He says it looks like it uses a combination of Postgres, Redis, and Elasticache. So,
there we go. That's good news.
Yeah, so it has a nice little Postgres connection.
Yeah, and I do love Redis as well. So that's another favorite database of mine. Although I tend to call it a data structure store whenever I link to it, rather than a database. But it's all semantics. Uh,
Why?
just because you are working at a much more low level. It's more granular. You're dealing with just, I'm storing a string, or I'm working with a hash, or I'm working with a list of something. Like it feels like another dimension down from what something like Postgres or even, SQLite or whatever, SQL Server is dealing with. So I tend to think it is a data structure server, but you could argue that, things like Postgres are also storing data structures. But I just I feel like to make the distinction, it kind of belongs in the same family as things like Memcached and, um, Berkeley database and things like that. It's a different thing to me.
Okay. Um, when you talked about your process a few minutes ago of, at both at the technical level and at the curation level and how your team collaborates and everything, one of the things that's new, like when I first started reading Postgres Weekly in 2017, I don't think you had this feature yet, but you now include a beautiful graphic banner at the top of the newsletters, at least the ones I receive. Maybe if you send a text-only version, it does not have the graphic, but and it's really interesting. Like I can always tell I don't feel like you just threw it up there. It feels like there's some thought and some intentionality to it, although maybe I'm giving you more credit. I don't know. So can you talk to us about how those graphics came to be and why, and are they working for you? And is it a delight to create them or a bit of a hassle?
So when I was running the Ruby Inside blog, one of my kind of things I made sure to always do was include an image in every single post, just because it seemed on blogs that kind of helped your engagement, and especially with feed readers at the time. People would see an image and they'd be more likely to come through and read the whole post. I don't know why, but there's just like some psychological angle to it, I guess. And I kind of forgot about that when I was starting doing email. I was just like, let's keep it really, really plain, really, really simple. I don't want images in my emails. I just want to keep it really, really plain. After some years, I kind of got addicted to another newsletter called Pod News, which is at podnews.net. And that's a kind of a daily email about the podcasting industry, which I definitely recommend subscribing to.
Is it
It's
still
very,
relevant?
very good. It's still relevant, yeah. It's
Do they,
it's interesting. It's interesting to people that are interested in podcasts as a business. I think probably more than just
okay.
average listeners.
So they're
But I
probably
really
not talking about talking Postgres a lot, at least not yet.
No, although
Okay.
if it was if they might mention it, that type of thing, like obviously, Microsoft have released this or whatever, but yeah, it's more about the industry. But it was one of the a few newsletters that I kind of took direct inspiration from in adding some new features. And one of the things that they always did, and they still do, is that they have a image at the top of their email, and it's about whatever the top item in the newsletter is. And I was like, I really like the way that works. I like the way they've implemented it. So I was like, I'm going to just steal that idea from them. And I kind of knew the guy that runs it and everything. He was very cool. So we began, if the top item in a newsletter had an obvious screenshot or something that I could just take, I'd take a screenshot and we'd put it in. And people seem to like it. People click on it, and great. Over time, obviously, we started to get a habit of having these in, but there wasn't always a screenshot to include. So I was like, well, what can we do for these? And I kind of had a weird background from many, many years ago of being very briefly involved in graphic design. So I had, I've always been addicted to Photoshop. I use Photoshop nearly every day for doing random things or, coming up with joke images or memes or whatever, and all this type of thing. And so I was like, well, can I use some of my skills there to produce these images? And so we subscribed to, I can't remember who it was now, like Shutterstock or someone like that, one of the stock libraries. And I would basically put together like composite images of things. So one of the worst ones that I remember in Postgres is that we had an article about auto vacuuming. And it was something about auto vacuuming getting stuck. And just I came up with this horrible montage of like a robot vacuum cleaner getting stuck under a table or something, and it's a terrible, terrible image, very, very cheesy, but it made me laugh, and I was like, I actually quite enjoy making these silly images, and so it just went from there over time. We've introduced all sorts of various different tools into it. I will use AI to produce elements of images and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, I do a lot of compositing work to bring things together. We don't just generate an image somewhere and just slap it in. We I need to make sure that there's a story kind of told in the image. And so I'll bring together icons and, bits and pieces and screenshots and put them together into something that kind of vaguely makes sense. So it's actually one of the most fun part of my jobs. I actually quite like doing the image for things, and it makes a change from, doing just purely editorial stuff. So
Right.
yeah, I enjoy that.
Yeah, so maybe your writing and the blurbs that you write and are fresher because you've had that distraction using another part of your brain. I don't know.
Yeah, it's kind
That
of a
could be
multimedia aspect to it, I guess. But yeah, in terms of actually drawing things from scratch, I have absolutely zero talent to do that. So, putting together montages and things like that and kind of newsy kind of pictures is definitely more my style. And actually, I need to shout out someone in that regard because um, there's someone that's put together like a public domain group of images all to do with like Gophers. So whenever we do stuff to do with like the Go programming language, we use that public domain stuff quite a lot, and we shout them out in the newsletter from time to time. So I just wanted to mention it, just because there are groups of people out there, illustrators and so on, that produce images that we do use and we credit them and everything. But it's very important still to have that human aspect in there.
So, on the chat, Aaron seems to have found an edition of Postgres Weekly from August 2022. And
Okay.
I don't know if this is the right one, but it's a very sad looking blue elephant looking at a robot vacuum cleaner that's on fire. It's one of those circular ones that kind of rolls around on the floor by itself. Is that
All
what you
right.
were thinking of? Or is it
Hang on, let me just quickly
different?
look at this link. No, it's not that one.
Okay.
But no, there is one that is it's very obviously Photoshop where I've put this table and a vacuum cleaner. It's just absolutely terrible. No, it's not that one. That is a very
Well, now
related
I
one,
want to
but
see. We're going to go hunting until we can find the
yeah.
one that's absolutely terrible.
Yeah, I've
I
shared it on
actually
our work
really
Slack numerous times because it's like the nadir of like my image creation efforts.
I really enjoy the graphics. I don't know why. They pull me in and they kind of anchor the post as well. And they tell you like what the top article is about at without even having to read a word, which is kind of cool.
Yeah,
Okay,
it can be good.
so you don't just do this for free. It's a business.
Yeah.
And I'm assuming the bulk of the income is from advertising.
Yes.
Just full disclosure, my team at Microsoft and prior to this, my team at Citus Data, we have advertised with you. I wouldn't say always in the last 7 or 8 years because, budgets come and go and projects come and go. But like most recently, we have placed some Posette ads to make sure that people knew about the Posette, an event for Postgres virtual
Yeah.
conference that we organize, and trying to get people to attend or submit talks to the CFP, or now that the videos are all published, to watch them. So, and we're not the only ones. Like lots of Postgres companies spend dollars advertising in Postgres Weekly, and I'm sure the same is true across the other newsletters also. Has
Absolutely.
building
Yeah.
up the business side of your newsletter business been surprising in any way?
No, I mean it's basically just fallen into our lap in some sense. When I began doing the newsletters, it wasn't like the current business model wasn't, what I planned to do whatsoever. So my original plan was I was going to have the Ruby newsletter, and I was going to basically sell tickets to an online training course that I was running at the time each month, which was an advanced kind of Ruby like online webinar type thing. I'd work through various Ruby concepts with people, and people would pay, $300-400, and I would get, like 20-30 people to join on that, and I would help them all out and all that type of thing. We had a forum and stuff like that. And so, that was good money. If you run that once a month, then, you have a full-time income. And so that's what I did in the early days. But then I very quickly realized that I'm just not, my brain just isn't in teaching. I'm not, really good at the real time thing. So I had these, people originally reaching out saying, "Oh, we've got this thing. We want to like sponsor the newsletter." And it's like, well, we don't really do that. But then I realized, well, let's just do it temporarily, and then we'll see what happens from there. Well, whenever I say let's just do something temporarily, it tends to become permanent, and I'm still doing it 10 years later. So that is very much the case here. It's another one of these things where it was a side idea, and just because there was the demand, it carried on. And that's literally how we got to where we are now. So obviously over time, I've hired people because I got to a point where we just had too much inbound business. So I had to hire someone to take charge of the whole sales side of things. And she is still with us today. So she's actually just celebrated 10 years with us. So yeah, it's worked out quite well.
Well, and the ads in Postgres Weekly at least are tasteful. Does that make sense? I don't know how much thought you put into that. How much thought you put into the placements or whatever the guidelines are of what you accept or what you don't accept, but they seem, I don't know, they seem to fit the tone that the newsletter has of being useful.
Yeah, we try to make sure that's the case. I mean, partly because that performs better. So if there is some kind of relevance, or even if it's like content, we do have sponsors that will literally link to a blog post, which can sometimes get a little bit weird because it might have been a blog post we were going to feature anyway. And so I try to maintain a really good divide between sales and editorial. I try not to get involved in sales because I don't want to be unduly influenced by it and say, oh, this company's great because, they sponsor us. I try and avoid even having that potential by staying out of the sales side of things. But sometimes it does have an influence on us because it's like, well, actually, I was going to feature this post anyway, and they're already paying us to promote it. So I can't have it as the feature and the sponsor. So sometimes it actually acts to a detriment. But most times, like the people I'm working with have a really good nose for, what is something that's legit and kind of earnest and interesting. It's not always perfect, but it's usually pretty good. We don't do outbound, and so that's quite important because outbound can really lead to low quality kind of sales.
What do you mean by that?
What I mean is, like, most companies that are in media, they will do outbound sales, which is where you look at companies that you might want to have or that you think have got lots of money, and you reach out to their marketing departments and say, oh, we've got X thousand subscribers, you could come in our newsletter and blah, 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 like, and do that kind of sales pitch, which we don't do. Like, I think we've done it like once or twice for some job ads like 10 years ago or something, but like it's not something that is a part of the business at this point. All of our sales are inbound. It's where companies have seen us, they've seen the newsletter, they know what it is. And quite often it's because employees at the company, so like engineers, have seen, been subscribed to Postgres Weekly. They get asked by the marketing department of the company, what's somewhere that's relevant to what we're doing, and they'll say, oh, well, here's this newsletter that I've seen ads in it before, like, contact them, and that's how we get the contact. So people that work at companies are actually probably our best sales agents in a way because they recommend us to their marketing departments, and then it goes from there. So that is our most common way of getting customers.
And then there's a question from Kai Ting on the chat about how your business team decides who gets to sponsor. Like, do you ever have people competing for the same newsletters? Because it's not overflowing with ads. Presumably you have a limit. We're only going to have, this many ads or these many sponsors in a given newsletter.
Yeah, I mean, we have different ratios that I'd like to maintain. The fewer the better, but obviously to a point, because obviously we're a business. But I try to make sure that we don't just have like ad, like it's not like a fashion magazine where it's just 20 pages of ads before you even get to the contents. So I've kind of just got this basic feel of what, if I was a reader, what I would tolerate and deal with. But then obviously the other aspect of it that kind of goes to Cutting's question, which is how do we decide who gets to sponsor? It's not just like if anyone turns up and anyone has money, then you're in. Our team usually is good at sniffing out things that are relevant. I have kind of directives that I've given them, things that I'm not interested in covering whatsoever or having involved with us. I'll give you one example of that, which is it's less important now, but it was quite big a few years back, which was companies that were very heavily into cryptocurrency. And it's not because I'm against cryptocurrency per se. It's just that when they advertise, it tends to be quite overly commercial and overly, I don't know if this is the right word, but kind of exploitative. The things that they're trying to promote, like there's no kind of like organic edge to it whatsoever. So they're the types of companies that we're not interested in, and like NFTs, things like that, just kind of turn me off. But then there's companies, that really make sense. Like, when it's someone that's providing Postgres managed services or something like that, then obviously for Postgres Weekly, perfect fit. And if they can link to content or libraries that they've produced or, things of that nature, like Timescale does with like their AI libraries and things
You
like
mean
that.
you
And,
mean Tiger
you know,
Data, right?
yeah. Oh, sorry, Tiger Data. Yeah, they've renamed. Or Microsoft with Posette. When it's things that that are going to get an editorial mention in some way, even if it's not the ideal way that the sponsor would want, that's a good fit because then it allows them to tell their story in their way if they want to add to what we're saying. So, it works out quite well in those situations. And yeah, my team seems to really get it and they understand what I'm aiming for. And yeah, we don't tend to we occasionally have the odd weird sponsor and I'm like, why did you sign them up? And we figure it all out in the end. It gets figured out. We talk to them and see what the deal is and what they're going to run, and we'll sometimes help them finesse and hone what they're going to run. But 9 times out of 10 we don't have any problems at all. But it's worked out pretty well.
Okay, so now I have a couple random questions for you before we wrap. And the first is, I don't know if you ever listened to the episode with David Rowley. It was on Talking Postgres last August, and it was one of the canonical "How I Got Started as a Developer and in Postgres" themes.
Yeah.
That was the title of his episode. And he started in a really unusual way. It involved a cheese factory and a forklift. And for some reason, then a whole bunch of the guests brought a cheese story to the podcast. And somehow cheese was involved in their journey into Postgres or their work on Postgres. So I just have to ask you, do you have a cheese story to share with us?
No, I mean, I absolutely hated cheese for probably the first 20, 25 years of my life. I couldn't stand cheese. I actually do like it now, but it's pretty much something I only eat at Christmas. So I associate it with Christmas and holidays. Because if I eat any other time of the year, I'm just going to get very, very fat. So yeah, I'm not a big cheese person, but when I do eat cheese, I eat it very seriously.
Okay, then. Books you're listening to. Anything you want to recommend?
No, I mean, I was addicted
Or
to
books you're reading.
Audible.
You don't have to be listening to it. You could be
Well,
reading
so
it.
in terms of listening, I was addicted to Audible. I had the subscription. I used to get stuff all the time. I would be listening to like true crime and murders and all these horrible different things. I never listened to anything technical like in an audiobook just because it doesn't work for me. Like I need to read that type of stuff on paper.
Okay.
But then it tends to be things like about the Linux kernel and things of that kind of nature, which is just out of personal interest. So most of the books that I read have no direct implication on my job. Unless it's something that I'm reviewing because I'm going to mention it in an issue or something like that, but that's not very often. So no.
So
But
would you
yeah,
say
I
you
mean,
read to escape? You read to kind of get away from your work?
yeah, I don't read a lot of books now. I used to read a lot more in the past. Because I got 3 kids, I don't really get a chance to do that now. So yeah, I read a lot of technical books just to kind of scratch the intellectual itch, let's say. But in terms of novels and things, I used to read tons and tons when I was younger. I used to read a lot of horror novels like Dean Koontz and Stephen King and all that type of thing. And then later on, sort of like very sort of highbrow sci-fi like J.G. Ballard. I was very heavily into for a while, but yeah, lately I've not read any novels in quite a few years. So yeah, it's very sad. But these things come and go with age. I think eventually once the kids have moved on, and well, if that ever happens, I'll be sitting there with a glass of wine in the garden reading novels again. At some point. But this is not the stage of life for that.
I'm sure you're going to be hesitating when they're in that last summer before potentially going to college, and you're trying to decide whether to encourage them to get a job or not, or whether they can laze around. You'll be sitting there thinking, okay, if I do this, if I do that, what are my choices?
Yeah, and yet the thing I know just from age and experience is that no generation is like the previous generation. Like, my parents couldn't identify with things that my generation was going through, and I already know I will not be able to identify with things that my children's generation is going through. So to a large extent, I leave it up to them. Like, I know how it worked for me. Like, they're going to figure it out if they're smart enough to, I am the safety net for my children. I am not their guide in telling them what to do.
Parenting advice from Peter Cooper.
Yeah, there you go. So maybe not a cheese story, but you get a cheesy story. So yeah.
I love it. All right. Well, thank you so much, Peter Cooper, for joining us today.
No, it's been fantastic.
It's been
The
really a
time
lot
has
of fun.
flown by.
It has flown by. All right. Wrapping up, if you liked today's episode and you want to hear more of these Talking Postgres episodes, you should subscribe on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Subscriptions are a great way to help the algorithms promote the show to new listeners. And please tell your friends too. And if you leave a review, that helps even more people discover the show. You can always get to past episodes and links to subscribe at talkingpostgres.com. And transcripts are included on the episode pages on talkingpostgres.com too. We actually put a little bit of effort to make sure the transcripts are pretty good. So yeah, let us know if we're succeeding in that. And a big thank you to everybody who joined the live recording here on Discord and participated in the chat. Thank you again, Peter.
No, thank you very much.